Good afternoon, everyone. So, welcome to our Wednesday Live, where I'm actually going to be talking to you today about what we've been calling the leadership lottery, and it's an interesting kind of concept when we start talking about what's the likely outcome that you are to get from an issue in the workplace and whether or not it's going to lead to a psychological injury. And there's research that was delivered to the Frontline Mental Health Conference earlier this week by a good connection of mine, a person called Stuart Bartels, who's actually part of the Australian Institute of Police Management, and they had done some research into what the literature basically says around the outcomes that you're likely to get in the workplace in terms of problems that you might be having, and what a lot of people kind of term the leadership lottery, which in essence what they're saying is your outcomes are directly dependent upon who your leader is and what your leader's sort of capability or understanding about, if it's a psychological issue, about that psychological kind of issue and their attitude and approach towards it. And that has a direct outcome on what capability or outcome you're going to get as that individual or injured worker. So why is this important? And it's one of the things when we start talking about prevention, and I've said to you, we're going to talk about prevention for the next couple of months. Prevention's one of the things, I'm one of the few psychologists who talks about prevention and prevention activities in the way that, well, how can we do things in the workplace that actually mean that we're likely to prevent a psychological injury? And I'm writing a new book called The Trouble with Trauma at Work. And as part of that, I'm interviewing leaders in certain sort of sectors where we know that there's sort of psychological injuries that might happen. So, for example, emergency services, policing, defense, all of that, but also some of those other industries that you might not be aware of, like the resources sector, so mining, and you may have heard about the fact that we sometimes get issues in fly in, fly out members and the impact that their, fly in, fly out kind of uh, life or working life has in terms of their mental health and their suicidal ideation and those sorts of things. So the resources sector, and in fact the Mining Industry Council, I think, produced a mental health strategy several years ago, 2015. But they never appointed any particular outcomes, and they never actually gave anybody responsibility for making sure that those outcomes were achieved. There were targets that were set, but there was no allocation of who was responsible for those targets, or in fact, no kind of real obligation about what the outcomes would be if we didn't meet those targets. So when we know this, that whenever we kind of develop some sort of strategy, if nobody actually has the ownership for the delivery of that, then what's the chances that it's actually going to make any difference? Pretty well Buckley's and none. So when we talk about, and I often will speak to people about their organization might have some HR policies in place or something around how we're going to improve the overall mental health outcomes of our people. But unless somebody actually has direct responsibility for that as part of their leadership outcomes, that it's part of a KPI that's, then linked to potentially a bonus for them as, the senior leader in an organization, nobody really puts any focus or attention on it. So I want you to kind of start thinking about some of the elements around these things when we kind of have a look at how we would improve things in our own organization. And if the leadership lottery is one of those things that is really clearly linked to the outcomes that somebody's going to get, how do we then improve the leadership in terms of their mental health literacy? And so we do education programs around managers and helping them to understand mental health literacy or improve their mental health literacy, because a lot of you, and I'm sure that in organizations that a lot of you are working in, many of you will have undertaken some level of mental health first aid or some sort of awareness raising. But one of the challenges that I find with organizations where they say, oh, yeah, we've got all of the mental health stuff under control. We've done mental health first aid. Everybody's done mental health first aid. That's fantastic because it needs to start somewhere. But mental health first aid, as with other first aid elements, needs to be reviewed, and you need to kind of go back in and refreshen up your skills, right? Because I don't know about many of you, but I did a first aid course many years ago. I would probably remember some things, but I have no doubt that actually the advice about how you keep somebody alive has probably been updated in the meantime. Would I remember, push comes to shove, I might remember some things. I could probably remember how to bandage somebody up and all of that. But if I'm not utilizing those skills all the time in my day-to-day work, then I'm not likely to remember the information that I had been given in that particular kind of training program. So mental health first aid is a good awareness raiser. But then what do we do next? Well, we need to really improve the outcomes of our senior sort of management or the management of people, and we have to do that at that kind of ground level. So depending on the size of your organization, we often find that when somebody gets promoted to a leadership role, and a lot of places, the first level of leadership promotion where you start looking after other people is a team leader or some sort of role like that. Now, depending on the kind of industry you're in, the person who gets promoted to that role, that first sort of tier of management, is not usually the people person. It's usually the technical expert over the team that is responsible for whatever that delivery is. So I had a conversation last week with somebody who works in a tech company, and one of the things that they said, this happens a lot, you've got a team of developers, and the industry standard is that you promote the best developer, the person who's got the most skills and best outcomes in that team, to the team leader role. But they don't usually have good people capabilities, and they're not usually given any kind of training to assist them in how to manage people. And this is the problem that we know then causes this leadership lottery down the track. One of the questions that I ask when we go through the psychological injury assessment that we ask people to do for their organization, one of the questions that we get to in that assessment is actually having a look at, what's the ratio of human resource trained personnel to the number of other personnel in your organization. And a few kind of senior leaders have really kind of taken affront to the fact that I'm saying industry standard, the best thing we could have is a ratio of one specifically trained HR person to 8 other employees. Now, in Australia, the average is about 1 in 25. In some organizations, it's even less. Now, when I'm talking about somebody who is specifically HR trained, what I'm talking about is that they've been given some specific training in how to manage people and what the obligations are in managing those people in terms of, bullying, harassment, understanding when they allocate work, when they do performance reviews, when they do these kind of things, how to speak to people, how to, check in with people about, are they okay if they call in sick? These sorts of things that we just assume in most workplaces are something that people kind of understand and know how to do. Or if it's written in the rules somewhere, that we know how to consistently apply that rule. But actually, most people don't have very good skills in this space. And, they might have an issue with the way somebody's doing something, but the way that they approach it often ends up escalating the problem and causing more challenges. And what tends to happen is then the senior leader either doesn't get any awareness of it until it's such a big problem that, somebody's walking out the door on stress leave, or they're being fed particular, perspective based on what it is that that particular team leader has decided is the problem. And it may or may not be the problem. So how do we address it? What do we do about it? And I think the thing to remember, and the main critical element of all of this to remember, is that it's really important to try and make sure that when we promote somebody, that we promote them and we give them the best possible chance of succeeding in that role. Now, that means that we need to actually have them undertake some specific type of HR training, understanding how we manage people, understanding, how people perceive certain things and what to do when you've, got to deal with a difficulty with a challenging staff member. I mean, we've all had these experiences, but we naturally, as human beings, want to avoid situations in which we might have to have a confrontation. So if it feels like it's something that, well, I think if I have to say something to this person that they're not going to like it and they're going to get really cranky about it or whatever, that's problematic, right? Because if they do that, then what they're going to do is they're going to actually, avoid addressing any of the issues that this person actually has, and they might be quite legitimate problems. And if we were able to address them in a proactive way, we would probably nip them in the bud from the get-go, right? So it's about helping people to, have difficult conversations. It's about giving them the skills to understand, how to actually, engage people with open questions, that even if you feel like you've got to give somebody negative feedback, I laughingly talk about giving people a shit sandwich. That's a skill, right? You can actually learn how to do that. If you've got a problem area that you need somebody to be able to address, we've got to be able to help them understand, why this is a problem, exactly what we're expecting them to be able to do about it, and where we're expecting them to get to, and making sure that we give them all of the supports that they need to be able to get to that next point. These are not skills that people automatically have. And I think especially in some areas where you get technical expertise, you have people who are very proficient in their technical skills for a whole range of reasons, doesn't matter what your industry is. They are the ones who then get promoted to the team leader because of their technical expertise, but they're never given any sort of I don't like using the term soft skills, but really that's what the industry will speak about as soft skills. They don't get given the information about how they can actually, mediate with somebody over a difficult issue, how to provide challenging feedback to a person with regards to, performance, how to inquire about what's going on for somebody if they've, taken a lot of time off. There's legitimate health issues that we need to be able to address. Somebody might have an underlying mental health issue. We have to understand how far we can go before it becomes an issue. Like, you can't, and I've had this with organizations in the past where somebody's got a diagnosed mental health issue. Um, it's not an automatic get out of jail free card, but it does actually have to be considered when we start talking about, well, is there an underperformance issue or not? If there's an underperformance issue and this person has a mental health issue, right? The fact that they're underperforming is probably, part of the issue around the mental health problem. But does that mean that the organization just have to continue to carry that? Maybe there's some adjustments that could be made to that person's role so that, their mental health is prioritized, but they're still able to make a reasonable contribution, whether that's a part-time thing or something else, right? A lot of people get a bit panicky about, somebody sort of saying they've got a mental health issue or they're anxious. And I talked about this previously last week. If you go back and have a look, I talked about the fact that, a lot of young people have grown up with this mental health literacy. They're very aware, but they kind of want to, hold it up and say, well, that's it. I can't do it because I'm anxious. Well, okay, anxiety is a normal part of being human. It doesn't mean that we necessarily need to stop things, but it does mean that we need to make adjustments. It does mean that we need to be able to communicate how we're feeling. It doesn't mean that everything kind of stops because I can't feel comfortable around the fear I'm experiencing that I might get this wrong. because then everything stops. And so it's really hard, because in an employment space, we've got to try and help people understand how that mental health issue is impacting the work environment. What can we do to support them to, and then adjust the work environment? And it's very much a negotiation around some of these challenges. But a lot of people misunderstand the fact that if they've got something going on in a mental health space, that means they're completely untouchable. That's not reasonable when we stop and consider the outcomes that an organization might need. There definitely needs to be some consideration, but a lot of people go, I don't understand what this means, and I don't want to get into trouble for, pushing somebody who's got a bit of an issue. But if we don't support people who have got different health issues in the work environment, then we can't actually help them to recover properly. If we take everything away from them and we don't give them any kind of sense of purpose or meaning or reason to strive for something, then we take away the opportunity for them to actually make an appropriate and effective contribution as they are able to do so. So it's a really, it is challenging, right? It's a delicate situation, but in no way should it be really looked at any differently to if somebody, breaks an arm, and then, they've got to come to work, and for a few weeks you have to give them something. They can't do so much writing because maybe it was their writing arm, and so maybe we need to give them some alternative things, but we have to make some other adjustments temporarily until they can, get the use of their arm back, and then make their normal kind of contribution to the work. So I want you to think about mental health issues as being, in lots of ways, not dissimilar to a physical one. They need to be taken into account when we're making sort of concessions or adjustments to the work obligations of the affected person in the workplace. But, it's not a complete get out of jail free, but it's also not something that should be, ignored or avoided to because we're too scared to work out how to actually make this work for everybody. So yeah, I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but you do have experts that you can call in that are able to assist with how you work this out in your organization if it's something that's been an ongoing bit of a challenge. But part of this also comes back to that basic training in mental health literacy for that management layer, that initial middle management layer. We often see it in senior leaders, but we don't necessarily get it at that low level, especially not newly promoted sort of people. All right. So I am going to be talking about this quite a bit in bit more detail next week when we're running the webinar that we're looking at the leadership lottery. We're looking at how we prevent psychological injuries in the workplace, including what we can do around bullying and harassment, because it's one of the bigger challenges, next to change management. And again, it's because often that change brings with it some perception management around the workload, and people often misunderstand a situation and will then kind of pull out the bullying and harassment element. So how do you make sure that we've, set the stage so that everybody knows in the organization what bullying and harassment is, what it isn't, when we've got issues and we've got people who have got, a diagnosed mental health condition, they can still actually make a really positive contribution to the work. Sometimes we just need to make some adjustments around either the time that they can do that, or their capacity at different points in time. And a big part of this is about negotiating with that person about what it is that they actually need to feel like they are able to make that active contribution when they're able to. So it's making sort of a little bit of flexibility happen, much the same that we've had to do since COVID. A lot of people, never thought that they'd be working from home, and look at what happened, and the world changed overnight, and we all got on with it. And we, a lot of people then went, oh, I kind of like this and I want to stay working from home. And other people kind of went, oh, I don't like it. I really like seeing people. So, a little bit of both. It kind of helps. All right. So making sure that from next week, we're actually going to be running the webinar. And if you're interested in RSVPing to attend that webinar next week, then please go to the link below. It will be down below once this broadcast has finished, and I'm about to sign off for you all anyway and let you get on with your Wednesday. Thank you for having a little bit of your lunch with me, and I hopefully will see you at next week's webinar. All right.